When consciousness first emerges within the psyche of a child, it's usually very weak and can only exist for brief, fleeting moments before being overwhelmed by the unconscious, which at this stage is considerably more powerful than consciousness. The archetypes consume a considerably greater share of the psyche's libido, aka energy, than consciousness, because they are pre-existent within the psyche, and they are already formed to a large extent, whereas consciousness is still taking shape. And so the ego is competing for energy against archetypal systems, which are far more ancient and which already have a pre-formed structure within the psyche. This is why things which you do out of instinct feel a lot more automatic, whereas using your consciousness feels a lot more exhausting, and you can sense a lot more resistance coming from within, especially early in your life. But in the course of psychological development, especially the psychological development which is promoted in the modern world, this initial power imbalance begins to shift towards consciousness. And it soon becomes the dominant force within the psyche, being able to inhibit the unconscious and use concerted effort to direct itself more deliberately. As the ego strengthens, it is able to exert a greater degree of control over the psyche and over the body, and the unconscious becomes weaker. Erich Neumann describes this process thusly. Only with the progressive systematization of consciousness is there an increase of conscious continuity, a strengthening of the will, and a capacity for voluntary action, which in modern man are hallmarks of ego consciousness. The stronger his consciousness, the more he can do with it, and the weaker it is, the more things just happen. So there is a process whereby the flow of libido, which originally sustained the activity of the archetypes, is sapped away by the ego so that it can be used to power the mechanism of consciousness, which requires a lot of energy to sustain itself. You can observe this yourself whenever you try to concentrate on anything for a long period of time and feel how exhausting it can be. And so sustaining this system involves redirecting libido, which is trying to get you to engage in instinctual behavior. The most fundamental example I can think of is when you suppress that urge to go and get food if you're hungry in order to redirect yourself towards something else, rather than letting your mind become seized by hunger. This polarization within the psyche between consciousness and the unconscious creates this kind of energetic tension within the psyche. And this energy can be used by your ego so long as you can maintain that polarization. Kind of like an electric field being generated when a positive and negative charge are drawn away from each other. And that energy is lost when the two poles come into contact, i.e. your consciousness slips back into the unconscious. This process, whereby the conscious system progressively seizes more and more of the psyche's energy in order to power itself, is driven by several processes, including a dynamic interaction between the archetypes, specifically the polarization between masculine and feminine. But I wanted to focus on one particular way in which consciousness is able to gain power over the unconscious. And this pertains to the language of consciousness itself. In a previous video, which I highly recommend because it can be quite enlightening to realize this, I've explained the deep connection between language and consciousness. But the link goes even deeper than language itself. And this link depends on a fundamental feature of language, because language ultimately depends on metaphor. Metaphor is the mechanism by which words are linked to meanings. And so to be conscious of something is to have some kind of mental representation of that thing, which stands as a kind of metaphor for it. And the metaphorical link between the object and your internal mental representation is that feeling of consciousness, that sense that you know something. This is actually a lot simpler than it sounds, because whenever you recognize an object, you are recognizing it, i.e. you are experiencing an activation of your internal mental concept of that object. That feeling of familiarity is the sense that you are conscious of something. And whenever you encounter something that you're not familiar with, your brain attempts to compare it with something that you are familiar with and to draw a comparison such that this new perception is linked to this comparison and you can gain that sense of familiarity. And so you turn it into an object of consciousness by way of a new metaphorical link, which is drawn between the object and whatever mental concept you are using as a metaphor to illuminate that object. This thereby familiarizes the unknown to make it feel known. And when we talk about the concept of a symbol in depth psychology, we're basically talking about the same thing. Because a symbol is an image which is produced spontaneously by your unconscious mind, and it can stand as a metaphor for something. And usually that something is beyond consciousness, but it can be made conscious through the image. The image itself can be used as a kind of metaphor which illuminates the concept. And so when the unconscious produces these images in the form of dreams or fantasies, We can seize upon these images by depicting them or even just describing them verbally. And then this allows you to represent the concept, even if we haven't understood what it means yet. And the fact that we can represent such phenomena in the form of images allows our consciousness to become acquainted with these phenomena and then gain power over them. We can speculate that the earliest images which appeared within the minds of humans were images which depicted the archetypes themselves, because the archetypes are primordial within the psyche already, and so it makes sense that our brains would produce images of these natural instincts. And so the very idea of a mythological archetype derives from this principle, because of the fact that we share archetypes. And once an archetype is represented in the form of an image, it is no longer something which automatically drives us through our instincts, but something which has attained self-portrayal within the psyche. The psyche and your conscious system have become aware of the instinct, aware of the archetype. As Erich Neumann writes, archetypes take the form of images only where consciousness is present. In other words, the plastic self-portrayal of instincts is a psychic process of a higher order. The breakdown of the amorphous unconscious into the picture world of archetypes enables them to be represented and perceived by the conscious mind. And so whenever the archetype is activated within our psyche, this image that we have of the archetype may also be activated to allow us to become conscious of it. And when we recognize its activity within our minds or within our behavior, this enables consciousness to seize the energy which would have flowed to that archetype and then use it for something else. Recognition of the archetype essentially allows you to subvert it. This is the power of self-representation or self-reference. Concepts themselves, which exist in a kind of abstract mental space, are then now controlling human behavior. And if you think about it, this is exactly what it means to be controlled by your ego. Your ego is a kind of abstract entity which exists in your mind, and yet it can cause you to act differently. And so this is what we mean by archetypal symbolization. It is the fact that archetypes themselves can be turned into mythological images, and these images being held in your consciousness reduces the power which the archetypes can have over your behavior. Because we can recognize their activity and then subvert the energy and direct it towards your ego instead. And this strengthens the ego, as Neumann explains. Liberation and free activity only become possible when the ego system has more libido at its disposal than the retentive system, i.e., when the ego's will is strong enough to break away from the corresponding archetype. Now, this symbolization doesn't merely stop at just depicting an archetype, but it can also involve illuminating different aspects of the archetype, depicting it in its various forms and complexity, as well as depicting how it operates within the psyche, or even how it interacts with other archetypes. These symbols may be described in mythology, but we should also note that a person's reaction to seeing these images or hearing about the myth may not immediately produce consciousness of the archetype. Because remember, the symbol is something which doesn't necessarily explain itself. All a person knows is that something about this symbol speaks to them, and it relates to them in some way. Only when the symbol becomes an image in consciousness with a more stable form does it enable the redirection of libido towards the ego. The image itself becomes a kind of active agent within your psyche, which takes the place of the archetype, or rather can take the place of the archetype. Neumann calls this the fragmentation of the archetype, because essentially the archetype is being carved up by your conscious mind and observed as a particular entity rather than being this amorphous, undefined force within your psyche. What we have called the fragmentation of archetypes is a process whereby consciousness seeks to wrest from the unconscious the material content of the archetypes in order to supply the needs of its own system. The wealth of images, qualities, and symbols is essentially a product of fragmentation affected by a consciousness which perceives, discriminates, divides, and registers from a distance. So what this implies is that all of the mythological stories which humans have created and passed down in writing or through oral traditions aren't merely just interesting stories that serve no other greater purpose. They were literally causing humans to become more and more conscious and to use their consciousness to elevate themselves beyond being merely instinctual beings. And so mythology and religious symbols actually represent a massive leap forward in the psychological development of mankind and were necessary for getting us to this current stage of consciousness. Without mythology, we would never have become this conscious in the first place. Now, this whole concept will be better understood if we looked at some particular examples in mythology. And note that this doesn't just relate to mythology, it relates to language itself, as well as things like religious rituals, which have a similar effect. But for now, I'm just going to focus on mythological symbols. And I think the simplest example of this phenomenon is the idea of God himself. The idea of God is often understood in Jungian psychology as being a symbol of the self or a symbol of the unconscious as a whole. Because think about it, the idea of God is the idea of some kind of agency or causation which operates independently of the ego. And so whatever happens out of your control may have been understood to be the will of God. And so the unconscious feeling like this force that's out of your control may have been understood as God. And so the idea of God itself would have made humans more aware of their own unconscious minds. Because the agency operating through their unconscious would feel like the will of God, which would have contrasted with their own egoic wills. Now, according to the zeitgeist of this channel, the idea of gods would have predated consciousness by several thousand years. So how is it that the symbol of God could increase consciousness? Well, we should note that this increasing of consciousness would have been a fairly slow process, but we can even think of the idea of gods as being a kind of step or precursor in this development, because in the bicameral era, the unconscious mind itself would have been perceived as like the voice of God, literally. So even now, the unconscious is taking on a specific form rather than just being merely instincts which force you to act. It's now perceived as a particular symbol, as a particular entity who's commanding you. So it's gone from being this undifferentiated thing into something with a specific form. And that itself would have slowly caused consciousness to emerge. So the idea of God being depicted through statues or being described in mythological stories would have slowly caused humans to become aware of this force emanating from their own unconscious, which would have increased their consciousness of this force. And arguably, this is exactly what happened historically. As we develop more symbolic expressions of this idea in mythology and through our religious systems, the idea of God would have fragmented, and it would have strengthened our consciousness and increased our awareness of God. And there's a lot of evidence that this is exactly what happened. Because you see in some Mesopotamian myths this idea that at some point the gods abandoned humanity, which you can think of as the ego taking on the role of God and then people wondering what happened to God. Now, there's a lot more I could discuss with that topic in particular, but let's take another interesting example. That being the idea of demons or the devil. This originates from the shadow archetype, and the idea of the devil would allow someone to become more conscious of the activity of their own shadow. Because the idea of being possessed by the devil or being possessed by demons was a way to explain how the immoral side of a person, i.e. the side of themselves which is being repressed into the shadow, could suddenly emerge and cause them to do something evil, something which is against their higher moral principles. And so the idea of the devil would have enabled people to sense their own shadows and perceive it as the will of the devil, and then possibly use their egos to choose a different course. So the idea of the devil depicts something which is very much real within our psyches, and the idea of the devil would have given our consciousness more power over the shadow archetype. And in mythological stories which depict heroes, we often see how the way the hero acts is a model for the ego asserting its own independence and autonomy. And so in a sense, the ego's own self-representation in myths would have strengthened the ego. And the reason we're so obsessed with heroes is because we see in them what we could possibly be. And so the hero is a role model for our own egos. And often what they do in the story is also related to the ego's strengthening position. A person's own ego can essentially adopt the characteristics of the heroic individual. And if you think about it, this individual influencing a person's mind can actually strengthen their own ego. A great example is the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is a very significant ancient myth from Mesopotamia, which depicts a brave hero named Gilgamesh. And the sense of this character having his own agency within the story can be seen as a symbol which informs the ego about the idea of having agency independently from the collective, or even independently from the archetypes. This is seen rather clearly because the goddess Ishtar is in this story, and she's a goddess of love and fertility, and she attempts to seduce Gilgamesh in order to make him her consort. But Gilgamesh refuses, showing that his ego is strong enough to resist the pull of that unconscious instinct, which I think most of us would give into. And so this symbol is showing how somebody can prevent lust from dictating their actions. Another example we can examine is the story of Moses. And this story again pertains to choosing to go your own way against the will of the collective. Because here we have an individual who was ruled by the Pharaoh of Egypt, as are his people. And so they are bound to this collective system as slaves, under the dictatorship or under the rule of the Pharaoh. But then their own God appears and attempts to get them to break away from this and go their own way. So this too is a kind of depiction of individuality. Not to conform to the culture or religion which is imposed upon you, and not to bend to the will of kings or pharaohs, i.e. the father archetype. And so this is depicting the ego breaking away from the father. And you can see how that idea would have promoted a stronger ego. The Iliad is another very interesting example because the entire time the characters are controlled by the gods. But that idea allows us to realize how often there are these forces within us that control us without us being really involved. And so by depicting these unconscious forces, we gain knowledge about their influence, which gives our consciousness a chance to choose a different course. By becoming conscious of those forces, which often cause us to act unconsciously, we draw awareness to forces beyond the ego, thereby strengthening the ego. And even the characters within the story start to realize that the gods keep telling them what to do, and they question it, like, what about me? What do I want to do? And so even the characters within the story start to develop their own egos. And so it's a very specific example of this phenomenon that I'm talking about. So hopefully these examples demonstrate the point that I'm trying to make. And if you have any more interesting examples from mythology, please feel free to share them in the comments. I would love to see what people come up with. But anyways, that's all I have to say. Have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.